First of all, good evening and welcome to the fourth and the final session of the first day of the Slop Conference. I'm Jahanvi and I'm a research associate at Belongg, and I'll be your moderator this evening. This conference has been organized around the theme of AI Slop. Gen AI has endowed us with the capability of writing content, cover letters, proposals, research papers that seem very polished and refined on the surface, but convey little substance beyond that. And that's the problem that we're trying to diagnose, understand, and also build solutions towards. So we spent our first day at the conference with engaging in some really deep, rich, meaningful discussions around the history of SLOP and how it's been manifesting in the areas of venture capital, impact investing, and also thought leadership. This conference has been organized by Belongg, which is a social innovation venture focused on inclusion, and Sinceriti, which is a recently launched blockchain based proof of intention platform that seeks to center human authenticity and intention in a range of settings, including fundraising, research, thought leadership, and more. And we have curated the SLOP conference to bring together important discussions related to AI SLOP. And the panel that we will be focusing on today is the hiring crisis when every application looks perfect. So I'll just take a few minutes to just frame this conversation and the way that we have been thinking about this problem for everyone who has joined us in the audience. So arguably, a lot of us will spend like a considerable majority of our time, our lives working, and beyond just basic needs and sustenance needs, our work also gives us a sense of meaning, a sense of achievement, and identity at an individualistic level. And when the right people are placed into the right roles, they help drive societal progress, societal advancement at a macro level. But these sort of benefits are only possible when the right people end up in the right roles. And hiring is that step to unlock that. And for most of us, we would have been exposed to at least some part of the hiring process in some capacity and could, to some extent, agree that it is a process that's built on trust. When I send in an application, or when you send in an application or a resume or a cover letter, you're expecting that you would be judged fairly by the people looking at it on the other side. And when evaluators, hirers receive applications, they believe that they can trust the signals that they're receiving from their candidates. So, writing a compelling cover letter would mean that you have deeply understood the role that you're applying for. And if you receive a rejection or an acceptance, it signals that someone real has looked at your application. But the juncture point that we are standing at now, and why we are hosting this panel discussion in particular, is that these signals that used to convey something have started to break down when AI makes it very easy for an applicant to write a very flawless cover letter, a very flawless, perfectly tailored resume. And the correlation that used to exist between the quality of an applicant or what they were saying, what they were demonstrating, and the true capability, that correlation is starting to break down. And this is what we have been noticing and hearing about. And this not only affects the outcome of hiring, but also the entire process. Hiring timelines have stretched, recruiting teams often get bogged down by thousands of applications for a single role. And this has started to create a vicious cycle when hiring timelines stretch, when there's increased competition for applicants to also feel the pressure to optimize their applications, and for recruiters in turn to start turning to AI itself to screen or filter candidates, or rely on their own personal networks to source candidates. And these consequences of missing out on a good hire or hiring an applicant that does not really fit that role are immense, not just for the individual, but also for the organization who has invested in that process. So, the key question that we are asking through this panel is what's at stake and what would the future of hiring really look like when these important signals start breaking down and when our current processes of hiring start getting overwhelmed. And we have curated a wonderful set of speakers to answer this question, which I'll introduce them now. So first off, we have Dr. Ruha Shadab. She is a social entrepreneur and the CEO and founder of Led by Foundation, which is India's first and only leadership incubator focused on empowering Indian Muslim women. It was founded in 2019 and incubated and pre-seeded at Harvard University. And since then, Led by has advanced more than 1,200 women and unlocked $5 million in income for them. Next up, we have Mark Egan, who is a principal research advisor at the Behavioral Insights team, which was the world's first government nudge unit, and is now a global research and innovation consultancy. Mark's work specifically at the intersection of AI and behavior science, developing AI-enabled research methods and building internal capability. He has led training on effective decision making and also holds a PhD in behavioral science from the University of Stirling. And next up, we also have Divya Nandi. She is a seasoned HR professional and is the CEO and co-founder of Sorted Hat, which is an HR analytics and strategy firm that works with startups and SMEs across the HR lifecycle. She previously was also a global people operations manager at Dalberg and brings with her deep expertise in understanding people and building culture first companies. So, very great to have all three of you on this panel today. And with this context in place, we'll spend like roughly around the next 70 minutes unpacking this problem and hearing from you. So, yeah, really excited about that. So, okay, just to get us started with the kind of context that I have set in, we are talking about what's at stake and what's breaking down because of the kind of changes we're seeing. But first, we also need to establish what a good hiring process even looks like, what the baseline even is. One that is good for not just the person applying, but also for the organization, and why it becomes important to retain the quality of that process, and what would be at stake when that process starts to break down. So I think I'll direct this question firstly to Divya because we understand that Sorted Hat ends up building HR systems for startups and SMEs that often lack the infrastructural capability to or the HR resources to build that themselves. So, in your experience, and you've worked with smaller companies, larger companies, what does a good hiring process mean to you? How has the definition evolved in your experience? And do you also notice any variations in the kind of clients that you work with or the kind of roles that you hire for? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Um, so for me, a good hiring process across the board, regardless of who I'm working with, comes down to three things. Clarity, transparency, and efficiency. So clarity, by that I mean, clear JDs. What are we looking for? What are the must-haves? What are the nice-to-haves? Infrastructure, interview structure, who's making the decisions, who's owning what. The second one I mentioned was transparency, both internal and external. So internally, everybody from the junior most HR person to the senior most leadership team member needs to be on the same page on what the role is, what the budget is, what the process is, who's making decisions. And often they're not. Externally, transparency comes in the way of clear processes, timelines, compensation. And there is often a unfair power dynamic in hiring between the hirer and the candidate. And when this transparency and when information is withheld, that's where a lot of the confusion comes in. That's where a lot of time gets wasted. And the third one is efficiency. And I should mention efficiency is not speed. So efficiency, I mean, the right number of interview stages, no duplication of effort, no unnecessary decision makers or processes, timely feedback, things like that. So not speed. Speed is rushing. What I'm referring to is sort of thoughtful efficiency. And all of these kind of work together. So without one, you won't have the other. Without transparency, it's very hard to be clear. And without clarity, it's very hard to be efficient. That's why when I am starting to set an HR process system or strategy for a client, I think those are the three sort of foundational pillars that I will focus on. And then to your second question around discrepancies, most clients genuinely believe they're hiring well. They'll all say we're merit-based, we're efficient, we're fair, we're looking for quality, not quantity. But in practice, a few things happen, and this is kind of regardless of on the kind of, I'm generalizing across roles and companies. Like I said, speed sometimes will just take over the kind of rigor we would like to see in these processes. Interviews end up getting skipped, criteria becomes flexible, and then good enough becomes the norm. And this basically happens because of a false sense of urgency that gets created. And this is something we see quite often in startups or in smaller companies where there tends to be less of an internal structure. On the other hand, larger companies or consulting firms or professional services, there we often see a problem of overstructuring. So the process is too rigid, the compensation is almost mechanical. You're not revisiting it, there's no logic to it. Or pedigree takes priority over skill or experience. So while you do need structure, there needs to be a balance between structure and discretion. And the third thing that I sort of see show up across clients and organizations that I work with is bias that shows up in really subtle ways. And one of the most interesting ones for me, because I do a lot of work in the impact space, is mission-driven companies, social enterprises. They are values driven, but bias doesn't disappear where values exist. For example, I recently worked with a nonprofit that wanted to hire a finance lead, but one of their mandates was it has to be a male candidate because our junior team is male and they will not take authority or direction from a woman. And that wasn't framed as biased. It wasn't framed as a problem. It was framed as, this is our practical solution to our existing team. But it did also contradict what they stood for. So to me, the real risk with the way hiring is going isn't bad intention. It's really just that sort of gap between what we believe is good hiring and what actually happens under pressure and under sort of some of the stresses that come with urgently looking for a hire. So I hope that answered your question, but yeah, happy to clarify.
No, that was really great, and thank you for laying it down. I think this provides like a rich framework to understand how like it varies across different organization setups as well. And I think you were bringing up like really important points around the unfair power dynamic, the way bias seeps into the process, especially like coming from like this understanding that we know best. And I think this will be like a good point to bring Ruha and her experience around this as well. And I think, Ruha, for you, a lot of your experiences in this domain have started from the understanding that the playing field has not been level for every candidate that who is applying. And I'd also like to bring in the hiring bias study that led by conducted a couple of years ago, that very systematically showed that there are hiring disparities in who even gets a call back in the process based on their religious identity, and Muslim women end up being doubly disadvantaged in that process. So I'd love for you to come in and maybe talk a little bit more about that research study, and also what a good bias-free hiring process would look like for the communities you serve, given that you're both working on the supply side as well as the demand side.
Yeah, first of all, just thank you so much, Anvi and Diksha, for inviting me to this panel and giving me the honor of being alongside Divya and Mark, who both do amazing work and have done amazing work in this space. Yeah, so Janvi, really good question. As I was pondering about this, I actually went back 10 odd years ago when I was applying to all my master's programs in the US. And I particularly remember Stanford's application, where their question slash thesis for the application was that your past is the best predictor of your future. So show us your past credentials and then we'll see if you're a good fit or not for Stanford. And I think that is a very faulty assumption because you're not factoring in how much somebody's past is predicated on the access to opportunities that they have or have not had. And you're not necessarily solving for somebody's inherent capability or potential. So the reason I share this is the area that led by the foundation that I founded in 2019 focuses on is on early career. And it's even more so important in somebody's early career to see them for what they're capable of rather than the opportunities they've had so far. And the led by research that Janvi are referencing to, I'll tell you folks in a few sentences what we tried to do over there. So the goal really was, I'm a Muslim myself, and the goal really was to bring in this anecdotal evidence that we've heard, and Divya was referencing to it as well, discrimination in the hiring processes. We've all heard about it, but when we would speak about it outside of the Muslim community, it would be hard to bring together all of this anecdotal evidence into one coherent or cohesive argument. So, what we did was we did a very simple resume study. We put out two resumes, one of Priyanka Sharma and one of Habiba Ali, and applied to 1,000 entry level positions in India. And we saw that Priyanka Sharma, the Hindu sounding name, received 2 times the job callbacks that Habiba Ali, the Muslim sounding name, received. And there were many other very interesting layering that was happening over here. We also, in the first 500 applications for Habiba Ali, we gave her a college and an NGO that sounded very Muslimy. So, like Jamia being undergrad or Zakat Foundation being the NGO that she served at. But even when we flipped the profile, and Priyanka Sharma was the one who studied from a more Muslimi sounding university or internet, such an NGO, the disparity of job callbacks continued to be the exact same. So, really, the only variable that seemed to be accounting for this difference was their name. And even within that, what we noticed was that Priyanka would get more phone calls telling her that she's made it through. So 40% of the information for a particular job that was given to Priyanka was through a call, whereas that number dwindled down to 18%. So of all the jobs that Habiba was getting, only 18% of them were phone call information or phone calls to her. Another layer over here was, so Priyanka roughly got 200 calls out of the 1,000 jobs, and Habiba got 100. But 88 of the 100 that Habiba got were common between Priyanka and Habiba. And they were often played out with Priyanka getting the phone call first. And when Priyanka would say no, Habiba would get called. So there's just so much to unpack over here with this research that we've done. Now, the question is, this research really points out to the problem and what could solutioning possibly look like. And a hiring process that I think is 3 points. Accessible, first of all, to folks is really, really crucial, that there's no gatekeeping. The second is, what are you looking for in the hiring process? This goes back to my Stanford story, which is, are you looking at a mix of skill and will? And for the social sector, and I'd love for like Divya to validate or did she not validate is, I think integrity becomes incredibly important as well to test for mission-driven organizations. Again, the space that I work in. So skill, will, and integrity. And the third, which is something we try to live through led by values as well, as we are hiring, as we are selecting our 400 applicants who go on to become graduates of our foundation, is that application or the hiring process should be a learning point also for the applicant. Like there needs to be respect for the time being put in by the applicant. And yes, sure, a rejection email is like at the absolute bare minimum to close the loop, but we strive to actually provide feedback if there is meaningful feedback to be provided, or at least a rationale for why we did not go with their profile, so they at least know, is it something they could work on, or was it just out of their hands? So those are the three things: is accessibility of the process itself, what the process is solving for, skill, will, and integrity, and then the process itself also being a little bit of a learning point or a feedback opportunity for whoever is applying.
Thank you so much for walking us through the details of that study. I think really interesting and very like insightful findings that I think we'll unpack a little more when we move to talking about the imbalances in hiring. I think something that Divya said around most clients thinking that they're hiring well when they're hiring, and also to some extent, I think Ruha, you've also brought that in through your experiences, that looking at past as an indicator of your future success. I think I'd like to bring in Mark for this point. Because Mark, your research has some of your previous research has looked at calibration and how like people think they're very confident in their judgment when those judgments might not actually be very accurate. And I think we can find like some resonance to that happening in hiring as well. And I know you don't come purely from an HR or hiring angle into it, but the behavioral insights team has been working on what the behavioral science behind good hiring could look like for nearly a decade. So, in your perspective, from a behavioral science standpoint, what would a good hiring process actually require? What does the evidence say about what signals can actually predict like good job performance, and what is your take on this question? Yeah.
Well, that's a big question. I suppose it's complicated by the fact that AI is also changing the type of skills that are now useful and required and scarce. So 1 or 2 years ago, the challenge of AI changing hiring, I think, was relatively containable. So in the context of BIT, AI was affecting the number of people applying for jobs at BIT. It was making it easier to apply. So we were getting hundreds rather than dozens of applications. And it was also raising the floor of responses. It was making it much easier to generate at least a 3-star response out of 5. So that containment problem has now, I would say, spilled out because AI capabilities have improved so much, even in the last few months, with tools like Claude Code, meaning that any kind of offline assessment, I think, can now be performed to a very high standard by people with access to AI tools. So I thought I had an okay answer to this question a few months ago, but now I'm less confident. I think it starts with introspection first from companies in terms of figuring out what skills they actually need. So if we're facing a challenge where if we try to hire a researcher and it's possible they could use something like Claude Code and get a 100% score on the assessment task, then why are we even using that as an assessment task? Right? It doesn't make sense that that's not the scarce resource anymore. We don't need a human, apparently. So I think I'm entering a period of introspection first about what skills are in requirement. I think when we talk about trying to optimize a hiring process, that's kind of a nice problem to have because it presumes that we actually have a very clear understanding internally of what skills we need to hire for. I don't think that's true, at least for my industry anymore. So I think that there needs to be first a period of reset. And then I think you need to rebuild atop that foundation in terms of a lot of the work BIT does about where we apply our research skills. A lot of it is about first defining an outcome measure. And that's often about facilitating conversations internally within organizations where you just first agree on what's important. And we're often repeatedly surprised by the variance of opinion about that, even when it comes to something like hiring for what skill sets. That doesn't mean reinventing the wheel, but kind of making sure that certain core principles are followed consistently, having a conversation about what skills are important, having a conversation about how you would even assess those things. That is much more complicated in the AI age, in my opinion. And once those foundational elements are addressed, then there are tools for debiasing that, for example, BIT has been using for years. The process we've been following is, historically, we wouldn't even look at your CV until quite late in the process. We would just have people answer questions in an anonymized format. Those questions would then be graded by our staff internally on 1 to 5 stars, and the higher performers would be invited to the next stage of the assessment. There is still like fundamentally a core process there that makes sense. I think a kind of blind anonymized assessment where you're trying to select purely on merit. Later, you might admit other information about the candidate at other stages of the assessment. And there is still a core process there that makes sense to me, but I think it needs to be rebuilt for the AI age.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. And I think we can also use it to like, and you, because you've already mentioned like how AI has been changing your own understanding of these processes. And there's this like, you might have like a clearer answer to our question like a couple of months ago, even. I think I'd like to follow up by asking, so you outlined that like, with the advent of AI, like the number of applications, the volume itself has increased, the quality of answers increasing. Like, what kind of other changes have you seen in hiring processes brought upon by AI? And are there particular patterns in how AI slop is showing up in your respective work?
Well, it's funny. AI slop is a little bit of a misnomer because the problem for us is the quality is too good rather than the quality is too bad. So the dirty secret of a lot of hiring processes is that it's mostly a process of deselection. So we might have 500 candidates and 1 or 2 positions. So we need a process that will effectively filter out 98% of candidates. And our old system worked reasonably well. It wasn't perfect, but it did reliably hire people who then went on to perform quite well at their jobs on average. Of course, you still have a probation process. You can never be certain in advance that a person's going to do very well in the role until they're actually doing the role. but we had a pretty good hit rate. So that very first problem is the increase in volume. There's just many more applications than before because the cost of generating the applications is so low with the help of GPT. The second is the slop challenge for us is that if we're grading scores from 1 to 5 star, 5 is the best. It used to be a lot of them you would grade 1 or 2 star, and now that's very rare. Everyone gets at least a 3, maybe a 4. And it's frustrating because you know sometimes that they're using AI. You can't be sure though. And it feels harsh to penalize somebody who might have a very structured way of responding, the way a lot of AI responses tend to be quite structured. Sometimes they make it easy for us because they include in the response, yes, I'd be happy to help you with this response for the behavioral insights team. They forget to omit that when they get their AI generated answer. So in those cases, it's a quick 1 star and we move on. But if we started with 500 and we might quickly get to 50 in the old model, now we're starting with 500 and maybe we get to 250. And it's like, okay, another laborious process is now needed to try and filter that down a little bit more. So we're calling it AI slop, but for us, it's actually this problem of a CEO of mediocrity that's making it more difficult to quickly find the gems.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's quite interesting, like how the problem is not like really about bad quality, but like an excess of like very polished, good sounding applications. And I think my next question would be to Divya, because I think you laid down this framework around clarity, transparency, and efficiency as like parameters that you would describe like a good hiring process with. And we've been hearing a lot about like AI creating uncertainty around these processes, the quality of an applicant, and how that might affect like transparency or like efficiency. So I wanted to understand from you, like since you have visibility to like both sides of the market, people applying and also people recruiting, what are you hearing from job seekers and hirers when it comes to AI? Are there any patterns in who is facing these problems? Is AI slop hitting all sectors equally, or our mission aligned organizations that you end up working with a lot? Are they particularly vulnerable to this problem?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll actually start with the last question really quickly before kind of diving deeper. I think across sectors, we're seeing the impact of AI on hiring. Everyone is affected maybe in different ways. To your point around mission-driven organizations, it's harder to gauge motivation, commitment. What used to be value statements or purpose letters, I can't remember what they were called. Now they're so easy to generate that, that's no longer a valid way of even screening candidates anymore. But cultural fit, technical fit, they matter in every sector and they should matter for every organization. So AI having weakened our ability to test that is a challenge that cuts across all industries, all organizations, large or small, all roles. But in terms of, the question around seekers and hirers and what I'm hearing in my interactions with them, they're both experiencing AI very differently. So maybe starting with the job seekers, from even when I was applying for jobs 15 years ago, there was always a focus on having buzzwords in your CV and keywords, but that focus is now massive. It's amplified, right? And candidates are often trying to reverse engineer what kind of words will get picked up by AI screening tools, what kind of phrasing will make me stand out, just kind of trying to get on the short list using an algorithm. So they're now writing their applications for systems rather than a human being. At the same time, there is also confusion around how much AI is acceptable. For example, a lot of professional services firms now require knowledge and ability to use AI as one of the core skills for that job. So there is a little bit of confusion around, what is the right balance where it counts as a skill versus what is sort of outsourced thinking. And that's a gray zone that I don't think candidates have faced before. On the flip side, with hirers and recruiters, there's just a lot of confusion all around. It's becoming really, really hard to know what's authentic. It shows up, in the CV screening, in, like I said, with the keywords, with your cover letters, those are sort of the obvious ways that I think they show up on a day-to-day basis. I think the most frustrating and challenging part has been the sort of assessments and assignments. So like Mark was saying, having that questionnaire at the beginning that they would do was such a useful tool, which now, depending on how it's being administered, can also just have AI responses. And those assignments used to be such a strong indicator of capability. It used to be the strongest way. Like, I mean, management consulting case studies used to be the number one way of how you would see how someone was structuring their thinking, how they were problem solving, how they communicated insights. And now it's really hard to know what's original, what's AI assisted, what reflects their real judgment. And that I think has been one of the biggest challenges. And what I don't think we've solved is what do you do instead of that? The one thing I'm not hearing about that kind of worries me is most of the conversations are about the volume of poor quality applications that are looking good. What we're not talking about enough is the good applications that get rejected because they're not optimized for these systems. And I actually, when I think about it, I can't think of many conversations I've had around this. People are frustrated with the amount of work, but what they're not realizing is a good candidate a very strong candidate who might just not have optimized their resume or their answer to work with your system, you actually might be losing that candidate. And so, that's another big risk that I don't think we're talking about enough, but something that I think we should start thinking about.
Yeah, and thank you so much for bringing that point up that sometimes even good applications get missed out or like chucked out of that funnel because even the ability or skill to optimize an application like requires a certain level of skill set. So I think I'd love to hear like Ruha's thoughts around that because Ledby has built like a very impressive community of alumni who are now ready for the job market, who apply to these opportunities, and it's a very engaged community. And the people that you're working with are also navigating a job market that already discriminates against them. So, are you hearing anything from your fellows and alumni regarding like using AI to craft their applications? Has it been like what has that process been like in terms of like trying to optimize their CVs? Or has it been like just another like demotivator in that process? Like, what are you hearing?
Yeah, thanks, Janvi. So we've been very encouraging of having our graduates use AI to spruce up their resumes and leverage it even for cover letter writing. They are ahead of the curve as it is because of the training they get through our fellowship program and then further turbocharged with AI. So you do see them reap the benefits of that, but I believe the gap right now is going to be, or the how far they are ahead of the curve is going to be a short-lived thing as more people start using AI and kind of to like Mark and Divya's point about like a sea of mediocrity or just a sea of AI improved resumes become a tsunami. But what we were doing back in 2020, which we've only further doubled down on, is making sure that our fellows try to create a human connection for their particular top choices of jobs. So reaching out to the hiring manager or whoever is in their network who works in their organization and trying to make their application now stand out more because of how much hustle they're putting in beyond their CV and cover letter.
Yeah, okay. I think what you're bringing out is that sort of return to the human and like the power of connections. And I think that also ties into what you were saying about integrity in that whole process, I think. I think we've been talking a little bit about how employers have also started to use AI in their process. I think with Mark talking about like this sea of mediocrity and like filtering, grading applications, we're also talking about how employers are experiencing and interpreting how they're seeing AI use with their applicants using AI. So I think we can now jump into how this is not just like a problem of applicants using AI for their applications, but also how employers might be doing that. And hiring has always had some level of a power imbalance. There's been information asymmetry in that process because there'll always be more applicants than opportunities available. So, how does AI and hiring slop reshape that balance? That's the broader question. Because we've been talking about applicants using AI to create like either like very polished, great applications or like just outright sloppy applications. But is there also an employer side slop problem that you're seeing or witnessing? I think we'll turn to Mark first to answer that. So, BID has documented how evaluator side biases. A lot of your research is focused on the biases that come into the recruitment process, halo effect, affinity bias. There's a lot of behavioral angle to that. And when AI gets layered on top of that, and I know that BID has been experimenting with AI tools in that process. What happens to this process? Like, what have your learnings or experiences been? We'd love to get a sense of that. Yeah.
I do know of some organizations that use AI in what feels to me like a rather dehumanizing way. So they might have, if you were applying for a job, they'll have you video record your answers. I know that actors do this for auditions. It's been common for many years. Um, they'll send a video recording, and maybe an AI will be the first agent to review your video response, and you might get rejected on that basis. That feels, it's certainly efficient. I can see that. It does feel very cold to me in terms of you not even interacting with a human at any stage. And it also just has issues of accountability that make me quite uncomfortable. But that's organizations I've seen from a distance. The organizations I work with that I'm more familiar with, I would say they're skeptical and are not rushing into using AI uncritically. There are also just practical barriers like the need for HR and legal oversight. That means the technology is probably capable of doing more than we're willing to tolerate at the moment. There's also known risks about hallucination or HR being a legally exposed function that make them a little bit unwilling to rush into it too quickly. It does, though, raise the prospect of replacing known biases with unknown or less transparent biases. The hiring platform we use, Applied, began as a startup within Bit and then became a private company. And that was very consciously designed to try and mitigate known issues of bias against candidates in terms of their demographic or other characteristics. A peculiar feature of AI, which I think was not anticipated by science fiction writers of the past, is how much of a black box it is. So the CEO of OpenAI will say openly that he doesn't necessarily know how or why ChatGPT or Claude or something else arrives at the conclusions that it does. The technology is getting better in terms of becoming more transparent in its reasoning, but it's very difficult to know if it. We might presume it has inherited the biases of its human creators, but it might be introducing biases of its own, which are even more difficult to observe or become aware of. So I'd say it's something that is certainly high potential in terms of potential efficiency gains of using AI and hiring in this way. At least the organizations I'm close to are quite wary of it for now.
Okay, and can you like maybe make it a little more concrete for us, like understanding this variation in how organizations are looking at AI use? Like, what are the kind of incentives that are driving that, and what kind of experiences are you hearing from the ground?
Sure. So we did an experiment where we used AI to help us grade responses. So we can't really do anything to stop this increased volume that we're getting when 500 people apply and it used to be 50. Okay, that's going to be continuing for the foreseeable future. We ran a live hiring process, and in parallel, we did an experiment with AI. So it was just a sandbox experiment. The humans still decided who would progress in the system. We just wanted to run the AI experiment in parallel and compare its judgment. So we found, like predictably, it was 98% faster than the humans who were doing the grading when they're doing the 1 to 5 grading of candidate responses. 98% faster, but we know that's what AI is very, very good at. It can do in seconds or minutes what takes our human experts hours and hours. And its judgment was even reasonably well correlated with the humans, maybe 0.8, pretty good. But when you look into it in more detail, we found some problems. So one is a kind of positivity bias, which, I mean, I think if would use a word to describe the personality of ChatGPT, for example, I would say it's very affirmatory. It's very, very keen. It has a strong positivity bias in the sense of whatever you suggest to it, it's very happy to build on that. So it has this strong tendency towards affirmation and supporting the direction of travel. So if a human would give this candidate a 3, GPT would give it a 4 or a 5. And the rankings would be kind of similar of who the AI thought was the best and the worst candidate, but the AIs were giving more positive scores. But the much bigger problem was that AI, it turns out, loves the sound of its own voice. So we found something very strange in our experiment results, which is that there was one candidate the AI really loved, and the humans ranked them number 63. So that person would never get close to an interview. And it turns out it wasn't a person. When we looked into it, it was the most robotic AI answer you've ever seen. And the AI itself, the AI grading it, loved it. 5 stars, which makes sense, right? The AI on the other side, the candidate has instructed the AI to generate a response, and then an AI grades that response, and sure enough, it loves it. So that's been that kind of bottleneck. I mean, we've done other experiments I'm happy to talk about later since then to try and use the AI in a more sensible way, but that's been a bottleneck to its immediate use in terms of trying to reap those efficiency gains.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting finding in itself. I think we've been hearing a lot about model collapse and AI feeding itself on its own information. And especially when you talk about the black box with applicants using AI, and also we don't really know what's happening on the other end, employers also using AI. I think that brings up throws a very interesting questions, insights around what would really. Okay, I think I'll get back to that, but I really like the point that they brought up around algorithmic biases in that process as well, like what you're talking about with with the black box. So I will turn to Ruha now because your hiring bias study, and I'll go back to that, brought out what human biases come in that evaluation process. That there are some biases that operate at an evaluator level. So now when AI seeps into that process and handles maybe, for example, like the first level of screening, what does that mean for applicants and for the hiring process in general? And since Ledby has also worked a lot on the demand side of that equation and directly working with companies to sensitize them around inclusive hiring, when companies end up adopting or will end up adopting AI tools in that process, what kind of changes have you seen happen already or you foresee happening?
Yeah, thanks, Janvi. So the answer is we don't know yet. Honestly, the research bias that a study that I was talking about was done in 2022 with data collection happening in 21-22. So reasonably before the sweep of AI supported hiring processes. And yes, the bias was pretty exaggerated with 50% difference seen in job callbacks. What we're seeing right now, one can only hypothesize that the AI powered hiring tools that are being used are only amplifying, unless they're very intentionally programmed by people like Mark and his team to not be that biased. But we don't really know the answer right now from our sample size, given that there are confounding variables like our fellows and graduates doing that human connection to get their application further out ahead of the curve. Yeah, we don't know. But the hypothesis would be that unless we are actively mitigating for these biases in the hiring tools that are being created through AI in our country, it's not going to get solved for. And then the other thing is if we talk about bias independent of AI, like we are talking about the solve to having a heavily AI focused hiring process is to also have that human connection. But the work that Ledby does, it's kind of challenging because the bias could play out in either way, which is like technology or the human that is looking at the resume. So getting in a human might bring in the human touch when you're talking about too much technology, but might still propagate biases. So maybe the best solve is to have tech that is de-biased, but I'm not sure of the extent of such de-biased AI technologies for hiring in our country.
So I think what I'm hearing is that we're still at a very nascent stage of unpacking what's really happening, with Mark's observations around using an AI-based grading tool and what you're also talking about. I think that really brings us into what we have been, I think, touching throughout our discussions around what kind of signals are we looking for, what kind of signals are breaking down, and what really would count as an authentic signal in the world that we're moving towards, which we are also operating from a lot of uncertainty around this. And there's also this sense of an arms race that we're observing, that applicants feeling the pressure to optimize applications and also employers wanting to deal with the large volume of applications that they're receiving. So in this scenario, if we assume that all applicants, even very genuine ones, like Divya was saying that even genuine applicants were trying to optimize because they might get missed out by the system that will be evaluating them. If we assume that all applicants will be using AI in their applications, what would then count as an authentic signal in this system that we're moving towards? We've already touched upon it a little bit, but would love for everyone to go deeper into what kind of signals are not reliable anymore or very costly to evaluate now. And I think we can start with Divya. So from what you were hearing and seeing across like the startups and SMEs that you work really closely with, and you've talked a little bit about traditional purpose letters becoming obsolete or like not as valuable anymore. What kind of traditional signals, in your opinion, have already lost their value? And what are you seeing your clients do to sort of cope with that or replace those signals with? And since you also work with impact driven organizations, and often they can be a little more resource constrained as compared to like larger organizations, what would like an authentic signal look like in this sphere? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one, and I'm not sure the space that I've worked in, we've cracked it, not even close. Um, so I think I feel like a lot of traditional signals are no longer don't feel authentic, don't really give us what we need. From the beginning to end of most things that are written. Right now, I think whether it's a CV or the cover letter or where they studied, even just how their experience is described, those are things that become harder to rely on. However, realistically, the CV is still the tool that most people rely on. I don't think we have figured out the solution to that. What I have the what I think we rely on where it is possible, just knowing that it is costly and time consuming, is anything in person. So what I've noticed is a lot of my clients over the last few years have now moved to requiring at least one in-person interview round conversation before making that final hiring decision. And it almost feels too obvious that that's the solution we have. But I think often just with resource constraints and um, other constraints that I'll get to in a second, I think that seems to be like the most sort of the easiest go-to solution, is having that in-person conversation and hearing from someone, knowing that there's nothing in the middle that is restructuring the way they're communicating, etc. I think it's also important to remember that part of that is because HR teams just aren't trained to use AI well. And that it's just something that I don't think people realize is really important, is for your HR team to know if you are using an AI tool for screening or for evaluation or decision making. The person using that tool needs to know how to use it in a way that removes bias that will creep in, or any sort of issues that might creep in with using that tool. And so I think that's why I don't think there's a solution yet. The one trend I am seeing is more things in person or more just on the spot conversations, which don't allow for somebody to use any sort of AI assistance. But that I know that right now that's a pretty basic and obvious solution.
And are you also hearing any concerns around the kind of investment that this process would require? Because like in-person assessments, that would in turn, of course, take like there'll be human resources involved in that. There'll be time that's going into it. Are you also noticing like this time, the kind of resources that now go into hiring, stretching, expanding? What kind of concerns are you also operating from?
Yeah, I mean, that is a massive consideration. And I think cost, and both in terms of time and money, is definitely one of the biggest considerations in having to have this kind of extra layer to the process. Also, the cost of training somebody to be able to use these tools, that's not something I think organizations were prepared for, especially in India. The way India hires for HR sometimes is just more sort of administrative. And so they don't necessarily already have the team that can perhaps adjust to this. And so that requires a lot more effort, a lot more thinking, maybe even like restructuring your team. And I think those are conversations that most of the organizations I work with, which tend to be small, medium, functioning on a pretty thin budget, that's not something they have the capacity to take on right now.
Thank you so much for sharing that. My next question would be to Mark, again around this whole idea of like authentic signals. And you've written a lot about the need for more authentic signals in hiring, and how you've been personally, like Divya was also saying, turning to human contact, making human contact an earlier part of that application process to look for signals that are harder to fake. So, drawing from your experiences and actioning that, in trying to look for authentic signals, like what has that process looked like, and how can like these experiences like been be assessed at scale, these authentic signals be assessed at scale?
So I don't have a permanent solution to this. Bit hires every few months. So every few months, we have to think fresh about what is our best and latest solution to this problem. So I can only tell you what worked reasonably well for us 2 months ago. But I think we'll need to do something different 3 months from now when we next go out to hire again. I also need to speak carefully about it, because if I reveal the precise detail of how we do it now, I think that would immediately undermine its effectiveness. But perhaps by way of analogy, what would ideally we do if there was no limitations on our human experts? I think we would ideally take the wisest, most experienced person at Bit, who knows Bit inside out and knows what skills we need, and is patient and empathetic and completely unbiased. And then we would have that person have a 3-hour conversation with all 500 candidates and get to know them intimately well, and call up everyone who they've ever worked with before, and get deep references from their past employers and do some practical skill assessments. And we can't do that. And that's why hiring processes exist, because we can't scale human judgment in that way. But the great promise of AI, when it's managed well, is that it can scale. It is possible in theory to incarnate superb human judgment with appropriate training and then scale it. I can't have a human colleague have 500 conversations, but maybe with training and with time, I can train an AI model with a 0.95 correlation with that human expert. And that I can deploy at scale very cheaply. Now, how do you deploy it? So, one principle for us and how we think about hiring is that we really don't like the idea of AI making deselection decisions. We just don't like the lack of human accountability in that process, not just in terms of it being unfair to the participants, but in terms of it being bad decision hygiene for our organization as a long term. It's very important to us that we have accountability and feedback loops within the organization. If something goes wrong, we need to know who to blame in the healthiest sense of that, idea. Accountability is very important for maintaining long term performance. So, the direction we're moving in is AI to help inform prioritization decisions. Because in the end, you start with a long list and you work your way to a short list. And then in the end, you do whatever your most expensive hiring process is. That might be in-person assessment. It might be a 1-hour conversation with a senior person. Definitionally, you can't really scale those things. So they have to be preceded by some kind of prioritization process. So we are comfortable using AI to do that kind of more holistic assessment at scale in a way we couldn't do before. One example might be a deep reading of a CV, not the superficial stuff, like the kind of stuff AI can do very easily. Writing like an emotional essay about why you want to work for this company so much. That stuff was a little bit useful in the past. It's not useful at all now. But the kind of practical bullet points of, what have you done in the past? That isn't everything, but it's a useful data point. And we want to assess that stuff fairly and at scale. We couldn't really do it in the past with humans assessing 500, 1,000 CVs. But if we can train an AI model to have reliable judgment in a way that we're willing to stand behind, then we're comfortable inviting more of those people to the next stage. So we want AI to help candidates. We want to give candidates more opportunities. We want to give them more shots on goal. We don't want to use AI to quickly reject them at the door. But there does need to be a transition to, it's interesting you're talking about, is it expensive to do in-person assessment? I mean, compared to what? It's expensive when you do a bad hiring round and then you end up having to repeat it a few months later. So yes, the realized cost of an in-person assessment day is very visible and salient, but it might well be cheaper than the relative alternative of just running an inefficient hiring process that 1 year later the candidate leaves and it didn't work out very well.
I think very important that you're also bringing out the kind of trade-offs that like an organization like yours is willing to make versus not make. And since you're using AI, just to quickly follow up on that, like since you're using AI at this particular part of the funnel, the hiring funnel, like what would be like certain trade-offs that are still like acceptable at that stage for you because of not having like a human evaluator read through the like deep read through the CVs, but through an AI filter? Like, are there any trade-offs that you're seeing or that you're like willing to make in that process? Yeah.
What kind of trade-offs do you have in mind?
Like missing out on like certain signals that you used to look for because now that
Oh,
process has been outsourced to maybe AI.
so I guess rather than trade-offs, I think in terms of a counterfactual. There is only so much time that we're able to allocate our human experts in terms of having them make the assessment. It used to be they did virtually all of it. Now they can still do a lot of it, but their judgment gets wasted on AI contaminated content and responses that they're reviewing. So I guess we're willing to accept a certain amount of risk, but you're always going to accept a certain amount of risk if you're having AI do some kind of assessment that the humans ideally would do instead, but they cannot do for reasons of scale. And the counterfactual for us is that it's still a marginal improvement to have AI be informed to be involved in a secondary supporting role in that way, but in a way that human accountability remains paramount.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. And I'll also invite Ruha in to answer this question because we know that led by through their fellowship programs, accelerator programs that they run, they are building like a lot of long-term relational knowledge of a fellow because there's a lot of deep, sustained engagement that happens with fellows when you're mentoring them, when you're coaching them, when you're engaging them in like very experiential activities that goes beyond any application artifact. And the fact that someone has been a led by alumni then becomes like sort of an add-on to their application because it conveys like a certain level of commitment, authenticity that has gone into that person. So in a world where polished documents are now like CVs, resumes, very easy to produce, very cheap to produce, are costly commitments then over time like one form of authentic signals that you are seeing in your experience, and are there ways that we can ensure that such costly signaling does not in itself become like exclusionary?
Thanks, Janvi. Just picking up on where the conversation was, right, in terms of traditional signals, what could be further authentic signals, and then to Neeraj's good question in the chat about skill and will signals perhaps not carrying the heft that they do. So I'm going to answer Janvi's your question and Neeraj's question in the chat with both hats on right now. The hat of led by itself, being a hirer, for example, for our fellowships, and us having to vet 400 high caliber candidates every year, and then also supporting our 1,200 alumni out there in the wild, wild west trying to land their dream jobs with all this AI slop around. So a couple of changes that we've seen, if you think about, so I'm thinking of a 2x2 matrix in my head, something skill, will, and then traditional and authentic signals. So if for traditional skills were your CV, the way we've tried to move that towards showing more authentic signals now is actually going back to talking more about your references and who are the 1-2 people that the person that you're applying to could actually pick up the phone and call. And I found myself leaning on that a lot more as a hirer, of actually dropping in a few quick messages to potential or to due diligence numbers that are there on resumes. And that's been incredibly helpful, especially as you see even more spruced up CVs and cover letters. And so if the next square on my 2x2 is looking at traditional signals through will, which Nirad gave the example of a cover letter, I agree. Cover letters are exceptionally hard. I think I just get so turned off by very polished cover letters. I'm like, give me a mistake with you. Like even for example, on this, even in preparation for this particular call, I was just like, I noticed like one error in an email, and I was like, yes, it is written by a human, and it made me more engaged with the email. So I feel that way with cover letters, but there is one part. So to move that cover letter from a traditional signal to a more authentic signal source, one is, yes, this costly time investment of getting yourself a badge like Led By or some other courses. And I am sensing / encouraging our students to exhibit their will through more authentic signaling, which includes offering your time to volunteer or intern for roles that you're super passionate about, to like show how much more excited you are about this role than somebody else. And it works. Like just today, I got a call from an electric vehicle startup that had a Led By graduate start off as an intern after that person was rejected for a full-time role. But in 2.5 months, they're now moving her to a full-time role, and her salary is increasing 5x in these 2.5 months. And she took the risk of going from a 50K rupee per month job to this internship at 25K, but now in 3 odd months has made that a 1.25 lakh K. And if she had not given that authentic signal that I know you rejected me for this full-time gig, but I'm super passionate about what you're doing, she wouldn't have landed that. So negotiating through offering internship, volunteership, commitment to roles that you really care about is another authentic signal for will, and reaching out to people, as I was previously talking about, in terms of getting yourself ahead of the curve with your application. So bringing back people more, showing your will in more unique ways. That's maybe one way to make me read your cover letter more, is if you talk about that, then just have the most perfect cover letter out there. And then one more aspect that I wanted to bring in, independent of this matrix, is definitely the number of applications, because the talent hasn't changed overnight, right? It is just how the talent is being presented that has changed with AI. You still have the same quintiles of people and their capabilities out there, but now they all just look equally good or so. So is there a way, or is there an interest to make the application process also harder? And that's something we've, as hirers, gone back and forth. Initially, our application process for our fellowships was, or had an incredibly low barrier. And we would get thousands of applications, and then we would have to vet them and stay true to our values. We would need to provide feedback to 1,000 odd people. And we're like, this is not sustainable. So we made our application process way more reflective, much harder to complete, more time consuming. And we've seen the quality definitely go up. So I think it's both. One is like, do you want to temper the number of applications, like the quick LinkedIn apply? Is that helpful to people or to recruiters? And then second is just to think, as an applier, how can you make your skill and will move from traditional signaling to more authentic signaling?
Thank you for laying it out like that. And I think what really stays in me is the second point around friction. I think, in some sense, just introducing friction in that process. And I think a lot of what Mark and Divya have also brought in is like some level of human contact, then ends up introducing like some friction in that process. And then you naturally, that becomes like a more credible signal. I think that brings me to the last segment of this discussion that we want to get to, which is we've discussed like some principles already around, like Ruha just mentioned, friction, early human contact, changing the way that we look at authentic signals to begin with, how we can communicate them better. Now, I think I'd love to move into like more of a solution space to think about what the future of hiring really looks like, because what's also coming up a lot is there's divergence in the way we are thinking about it or what evidence is showing us, and a lot of us are in some way or another experimenting with it. And so I think the broad question that I have for all three of you is that we've been talking about how the quality of our traditional signals, resumes, cover letters, interviews are starting to get affected to some extent, get degraded to some extent because of AI, because of AI slop. Are there ways to improve upon these existing ways of assessment? Or, in your experience, or if there's something you've already actioned, do we need entirely new ways of assessing people, and what would be the cost or the trade-offs of actioning that, and what might those new ways even look like? that could make hiring, like Mark was bringing out, that it has sometimes becomes like a dehumanizing process if it's a complete AI evaluation. Like, are there ways to turn it into a more human process, essentially? So I think I'll direct this first to Mark, and I also see there's like a lot of discussion happening in the chat. So if you were discussing or designing the next generation of hiring infrastructure from scratch, knowing what you now know about AI slop, and that AI slop itself could be a misnomer, what would that look like? And would it still be task based, like what BIT is trying to achieve through applied, or would some other elements also need to be included in that process?
The short answer is I don't know, or certainly I don't have a confident answer. But I need to find answers because I'm continuing to hire in the next few months. I also should note I'm not a hiring expert. I'm a researcher. That's the lens I come at this with. So right now, I'm faced with this challenge of the latest frontier AIs basically break all of the hiring tests that we've used in the past. They get a maximum score on it. This is situations where we might send a prospective researcher a data set and say you have to respond within 2 hours with your code and with your analysis. That used to be a good test. It's not a good test anymore. That's changed just in the last few weeks and months. So it's also a good confronting question for me, because why am I even using that as an evaluation rubric if AI can do it? So before I would give a response about what hiring needs to look like, I feel like I need to go for a long walk and think about what are the actual scarce skills, because maybe you join the company and you can use AI to do a lot of the work. And again, this has all changed dramatically just in the last few months with the advent of tools like Claude Code and GPT Codex, and with the predicted future improvement of those tools. So, okay, there's certain 101 things with basic professionalism that I still want, right? You comport yourself well in meetings, you're capable of behaving professionally and collegiately with other people. But then what becomes scarce? It's not technical skill the way it was true before. I think it's something about agency. We talk a lot about agentic AI, but we still like agentic humans. So people who are very good at directing themselves towards a goal and maybe working with AI to get very, very far in maybe reaching that goal before they need to call upon the support of someone else. I think this is interacting in interesting ways with the hybrid age. There's a lot more hybrid work. There's a lot more people kind of working alone themselves in a kind of Chinese style examination cell. And people who do well in that environment, they have maybe more introverted personalities. I think they'll benefit. That's maybe a skill. Introversion is becoming more valuable in consultancy. 10 years ago, it was very different. Big personalities, extroversion, that was very well rewarded. It's not so true anymore. And maybe for solving for right now, I think one important thing is taste, having good taste. So good researchers, you could be a 25-year-old, just finish your master's degree, and your taste might be much better than your ability. So you might read a paper about a complicated econometric design or a randomized field control trial and think that's amazing, and I can see why that's good. I can't do it myself right now. I can't implement that the way you might appreciate good painting, but not be able to paint like a Renaissance master. So the people who have good taste, I think they'll now be able to ramp up their skills more effectively because they can oversee an AI agent who will be able to perform to a very high standard. But it's kind of a paradox. Like, you want a junior person with the taste and experience of a senior person. Those people do exist, but they're rare. It used to be we would give them a 10-year apprenticeship and help them develop that experience. But that is actually the kind of end goal that we want a lot of our juniors to get to. Not necessarily it's about doing the work themselves. It's about recognizing what good work looks like. But for the longer term answer for this, I really don't know, because I think that the ground is shifting so profoundly in terms of what skills organizations even need now or in 5 years that I don't have a confident answer for what the future will look like.
Thank you for a very honest answer. And what you're talking about scarce skills, just to again quickly follow up on that, would you agree with the kind of dichotomy that a lot of us lay in terms of like hard skills versus soft skills, and the value of soft skills increasing in the future? Is that like a framing you would agree with, or what's your take on that?
I think about this in the context of my daughter. She's 10 years old, one of my daughters, and sometimes she'll have a window in her week, 5 p.m. on a Tuesday after school, and I can choose to fill that hour with some extracurricular activity. And I have to choose hard skills or soft skills. And yes, I'm choosing soft skills. I think to myself, why should I make her do an extra hour of maths class or English class? Yes, I want her to have a certain level of foundational ability, but does that make sense that she should focus just on doing something AI can do better now, will be even better at in 10 years when she enters the labor market? I can see my job changing right now. Should I be so naive as to just equip her with the same hard skills that were valuable 10 years ago? So, what soft skills do I value instead? I look at my daughter and I think, what can AI not give her, not take away from her? Social skills, confidence, physical fitness. So, one joke I have about this is that maybe hiring is going to turn into what it looked like 100 years ago. You're going to meet somebody and shake their hand and test the strength of their grip and say, what did your father do for a living? And did you play rugby in school? It's going to collapse to some simpler, reduced version of characteristics that maybe were valued in the past might become valued again as AI starts to automate more and more other conventional skills.
Maybe like turning back to things that are like harder to replicate, harder to maybe codify in that way. Thank you so much for sharing that very interesting example. Uh, I think now I'll turn to Divya because I think you bring in a very interesting perspective because you're working directly with companies and establishing the very set processes that we're talking about and laying down the ground and infrastructure for HR systems for organizations that don't often have formal processes. So, in your opinion, and what you've also been talking about, that some traditional signals have become a little unreliable. In your perspective, like what kind of structural design principles or what kind of things, lessons we need to keep in mind as we design like the future of hiring, especially for more lean and like nimble startups and SMEs that you work with?
Yeah. If traditional signals are weakening, I don't think the answer is to remove humans from the system. I don't think the answer is to just rely on humans either, like we have, in the past. Um, the the sort of structural principle I would anchor on is to use AI to improve efficiency, but and I'm saying that at this point of where we are in the kind of tools that we have. So to use AI to improve efficiency, but keep humans responsible for judgments and decisions. And I say this with a huge caveat that human judgment is not perfect. It's far from it. And I think, Ruha also brought up a point on, if bias creeps in, which one is more dangerous, right? So I am saying this just keeping in mind the restrictions and the kind of tools that we have now or that are being used most widely. So the way I would think about it is your system or your AI tool should maybe focus on eliminating the clear no's, but not deciding the yeses. So AI can be really useful, and I don't even know if it's as complicated as AI, but your system can be really useful as at clearing the deal breakers. Miss anybody who's missing the must-haves is not eligible, but should not be deciding who actually gets through, and certainly should not be deciding the maybes, right? The gray area that I think I talked about a little bit earlier. The candidates who are promising but aren't perfect on paper, aren't optimized for your system, those candidates need human review. And often those are the strongest candidates. And that has been my experience in hiring as well. Is those gray area candidates are often the ones that last the longest, they care the longest. So AI should not be responsible for that. I think that needs, at this point of where we are, it needs human judgment. The other thing to keep in mind, I think, would be just to remember that AI tools learn from data and patterns in your organization. So, your recruitment tool, more often than not, is part of a larger HR system, HR, MSIS, whatever you want to call it. So your current team lacks diversity, and if your leadership team follows that same pattern, say fewer people of color, fewer women, those are things we often see. So I'm giving you those as examples. Your AI tools might start reinforcing that pattern. So unless organizations are very intentional about how they're training these tools, how they're using these tools, I think that there is that risk that I think we touched upon earlier in the conversation as well, where AI can sort of quietly amplify that bias. Um, and most most companies, especially smaller companies, are not equipped to train these systems thoughtfully. Like we talked about earlier, like I mentioned, if you're not training your HR team to use these systems properly, I think there is a bigger risk than a human making a lot of these decisions, or I think it is a bigger risk than human bias. And like I said, a lot of this training does end up focusing on some of the team. It's not something that's not being done at all. I just don't think that kind of training is being given to the teams that perhaps need it to make their AI tools as efficient and effective as possible. And the last thing I think I would definitely, another sort of anchor is building in feedback loops. So to track whether or not your AI assisted system is actually improving the process, I think we often just assume it's better. And that's not necessarily the case. So start actively looking at the data, look at the quality of hire, both short term as well as long term. How diverse is the shortlist? How diverse is the final list that you've hired? What was the time to hire? And start looking at some of this to really make sure over time, not just one off, that you really are seeing improvements the way you want to see improvement in the process. And without that kind of measurement, we go back to the issue that I think Mark was talking about, where AI just sort of becomes a black box. So for right now, I would just say use AI in your systems to make your process smarter and more efficient. Replace scheduling, sorting rather than screening, prioritizing, repetitive communication, task heavy documentation, some of the clearer sort of some of the obvious screening if needed, but don't rush to automate judgment and decisions. I don't think we're at a point yet where AI can replace that decision making. And I don't think we should be rushing towards that, because I think through the conversation today, we've realized there is a large risk at kind of making assumptions and rushing towards letting AI make a lot of those decisions.
So I think what I'm getting from that is just like sort of pausing and looking at the limits of the tech that we want to incorporate in these processes as well. And I thank you for laying out I think, very comprehensive in terms of human judgment, data, and its limits to begin with, and also setting of feedback loops there. Uh, Ruha, would also love to know your take on this, because Led By, through its programs, has built sort of like a solution to some extent to this problem by building like a parallel pipeline of very skilled alumni that companies can then just directly recruit from. So what lessons do you draw from this experience, and do you think would be important to keep in mind, especially when you brought in the human versus tech bias dichotomy as well, and how that's interacting with each other?
Yeah. So I'll share a couple of stories, right, to give this answer. So, for example, the LinkedIn quick/smart apply button, which I don't think has too many fans out there because it just gets you bazillions of applications, and neither do you find the right person, and neither does a person ever hear back from that application. And I share that because I was just reflecting on another recent success story from Led By, where a very competent person applied for a role post Led By on LinkedIn and then exhibited her will some more by finding a connection at that company who is a connection of mine, and reached out to me and asked me to put in a referral. She is now a full-time team member of that company, but she didn't hear back from the LinkedIn role, for example, or the LinkedIn application for months. And the only thing to get into the interview pipeline was a personal referral by Ruha to the founder of that company, which is bringing back in that human touch, because also recruiters are, or hirers are, also feeling the burden of getting thousands and thousands of applications, which kind of, to Mark's point, like it's not just the person shaking your hand, but people also maybe leaning more on their own communities of trust to hire people, because that is helping them just figure out who's better suited and who's standing out now from this pile of everybody looking like they're amazing. So one aspect is, again, putting yourself ahead of the curve by finding those human connections and exhibiting your will by referencing those networks. I will also say at the same time that a principle for hiring is that talent is everywhere, but access to opportunities are not. And what tech can really help us do is make these jobs more accessible. It can go much further down the network threads than, for example, I shared a positive spin of the story, which is this person leveraged me and got herself that job, right? But now she had like access to power that she was much closer to these doors. But there's probably an equally talented person who just doesn't have those access or those access to power doors just yet. But technology can help you do that. Another story is when COVID's second wave was ravaging India, Redby started a bridge fund where we said if your family has lost your primary male breadwinner and a woman is doing something, anything, to start becoming that primary breadwinner, we will give you a stipend for 3 months to bridge that gap, right? So if you're doing an unpaid internship, we'll pay you, and then inshallah, that will become a full-time role. This was for Muslim women or Muslim families. And we had 30 such stipend opportunities. And Janvi, almost all of them were referred to us by Hindu families. So what was happening was technology helped us get all the way to that last point on our network thread, which was a Hindu family who got that message on their phone and then turned around and actually made the connection to the driver's family or to the housemaid or to the tailor. But I think without technology and without that intentionality of whom are you trying to go for, we would not have been able to reach these people who don't necessarily have access. So just leveraging technology with that intentionality to go further down network pipelines that previously was not possible is also something else that we should and could look at. And I also just wanted to answer Mark's really good question in the chat, which is a little bit about the difference of leveraging AI recruiting / the challenges it brings to early career versus late career. And I bring this now with the perspective of biases in India based on our major fault lines. And Mark, interestingly so, I would argue that it is easier, perhaps, for a marginalized or discriminated community member to land their first job than to land a leadership job later on in their career. Based on anecdotal evidence, of course, but perhaps there's a world in which, again, if AI is built in a debiased function, it might help both early and late stage in completely different ways. I'll pause here, Janvi.
Thank you so much for that. And I also see that we are almost at time. And I know that like a lot of questions have already been answered in the chat, but just in case we've missed out on anything, I see a question or a comment, I think, by Elaine. Elaine, if you're still on the call, you'd like to unmute and ask it. Otherwise, I can also read it out. I don't think they're there. I'll just read out Elaine's question. So they've written, as I understand it, AI is knowledge based, humans are not. There is no knowledge silo and separate processing. Is it possible that in addressing recruitment to knowledge, uh, easy to assess with AI, it helps create the problem? If the aim is to identify cognitive flexibility and adaptability in conjunction with knowledge, then perhaps a slightly different approach focusing on meaning and compositionality might help. This is sort of thing easiest done in person. If anyone has any reflections or would want to comment on that.
I mean, I don't disagree, but it goes to Mark's good point about like there's a cost to all of this as well, right? So in person is, yes, in many ways, one could argue that it's best done in person, but are there ways to leverage technology to have the same effectiveness and efficiency without the biases more cheaply?
Thank you for that. And Neeraj, you've also put in a question around, I think, problem with the skill signals and their deterioration. If you'd like to ask that, I think. It's the only
It's
question that
already been
hasn't been
answered. I
answered.
think I'm good. That's been
Okay.
commented on, so I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Yeah, but I do have a question if there's nobody else asking a question. So, first of all, thank you, Mark and Ruha and Divya. So, two questions. One is the pace of change is very high, right? So let's say pre-AI, we had a lot of research was done to figure out what are good hiring processes, where is the equilibrium. There's a lot of data. Let's say, for instance, Google released a very famous study on their own hiring over the years and sort of identified some 5 or 6 different drivers of good hiring, right? So, what are the data points that led to good performance in the job? And they could do it because they obviously had a huge sample size of tens of thousands of Google employees over many, many years in an environment which was somewhat stable, right? The performance assessment criteria was somewhat stable, etc. Now the world is changing dramatically. Mark, you said that you don't even know what kind of jobs will exist. That's number one. Number two, the capability frontier is changing. So what do you assess? What is the true additionality of a human being in whatever job might exist? And hence, what is the nature of the performance metric and how it needs to change? That's also going to be very, very dynamic, right? So if you look forward, do you think we'll always be kind of experimenting? Like, does the future of hiring involve a lot more experimenting, a lot more catching up, a lot less certainty than the past? And should we just shift our mental model, right? Because our mental model might still be that, look, some solution will be a stable equilibrium, right? And maybe that's not what the future will hold, at least in the next 5 to 7 years. What's your? I know it's a macro question, but any kind of gut feel answers, any sort of answers?
I think regular experimentation, but then accepting the results with low to medium confidence. I don't think there will be any single experiment that makes you think, okay, I've solved it. AI for the hiring for the AI age. I know how to do it now. It's a little bit like we're all waiting for the iPhone, like for the technology to kind of stabilize and establish a new normal. So you could buy the best phone there was in 1998, but you still want to upgrade it every 2 or 3 years because it's getting a little bit better, a little bit better. It's still changing. But I think this big iPhone moment where we reset a new equilibrium and now the capabilities of AI are quite stable, organizations can reorient around that, and it's becoming clearer which skills are more important. That's what I think. But I mean, I'm not a deep expert in this area, but as a pragmatist who's having to respond to it, that's my expectation.
I think just to add to that question, I don't think that experimenting with how we hire is new. I think we've already been doing it for years. It's just one, I think the pace at which we experiment will change. I also think the unknowns are a lot more now. I think it is just, you know, the knowledge or the technical knowledge is so advanced that your HR team and management team that's running this sort of let's try this in the processes may not have all the information they need. But 10 years ago we were doing psychometric tests and Myers-Briggs, and then we did case studies. I mean, that's been happening for ages, but people have been experimenting for a while. I think it's just the pace and the reliance of technology, which is going to make it a little bit more challenging and maybe exciting.
Thank you both. Back to you.
Yeah. I think with that, we're almost at time. So, I'd firstly like to thank Mark, Divya, and Ruha for being a part of this panel and for the rich discussion. And yeah, this was wonderful. And with that, I'm very happy to conclude the first day of the Slop conference. And over day 2 and 3, we have a bunch of other conversations, diagnosing the problem of slop in other domains, as well as looking forward towards building solutions, some of which we've already been discussing, and sort of consolidating all of that. Uh, my colleague Diksha has also put in the chat the Museum of Slop that we are hoping to launch by the end of this conference. And you can already start submitting your stories. And with this digital archive that we're curating, we want to document stories, anecdotes of how slop has impacted your own life and your own work and processes. So feel free to drop in an entry, and we'd be very happy to exhibit that at the Museum of Slop as well. And yeah, with that, I think we can end this session. Again, thank you so much to everyone who showed up and participated.
Yeah, and tomorrow, the first session is at 9. The same Zoom link will work. So hope to see many of you there. Okay. Bye. Thanks, Ruha. Thanks, Divya. Thanks, Mark.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye.
Janvi,
Thank
for taking
you.
us through this journey. Bye, Mark. Bye, Divya.
Bye.